I speak to you in the name of our crucified Lord. Amen.
Amen.
I was putting my son Gordon to bed a few nights ago, and he sometimes likes to procrastinate at bedtime. So he had a series of anecdotes and stories that he wanted to share with me, and when that was kind of running thin, then he started to ask me questions. And when those questions were starting to run a little thin, then he asked me the question. He said, "Mommy, I don't understand why God let Jesus suffer. I don't understand why God let Jesus suffer. Didn't God love Jesus?" I was transported back immediately to my own childhood and to my own wrestlings with this story of crucifixion and suffering. And I remembered as a little girl working it out in my own mind that although the Bible didn't say so, surely God shielded or anesthetized Jesus from the pain of the cross. Surely God could not have allowed Jesus to suffer like what was described on the pages of Scripture. As I was thinking about Gordon's question and my own childish imaginings, I realized that there is a thread that runs throughout Christian history that very much pushes back against the realities of the cross. Now we can see that pushback start with Jesus' very own circle of friends, who certainly get involved with Jesus because they think he is the Messiah and the Son of God. But they hope, they expect that such a title and such a truth is going to lead to nothing other than good things, to worldly success, to an earthly crown, to palaces and acclaim, and worldly goods. We can see that when Jesus begins to describe to them what really does lie ahead, humiliation, rejection, suffering, and death, we can see that they want no part of that. They don't want to hear it. They try to correct Jesus, and when all else fails, they simply become sleepy and forgetful and pretend that none of those conversations ever happened. But that pushback against the cross doesn't end with the disciples. The first several hundred years of Christian history, I was astounded to learn the cross was not the primary symbol or even the public symbol of Christianity at all. Because, of course, Roman citizens knew exactly what the cross represented. It represented the most shameful and horrible way that a human life could come to its end. And they didn't quite know how to share that part of the story with the world around them. All through the past 2,000 years, we can see preachers and teachers pop up who style themselves as Christian leaders and yet who proclaim a sort of prosperity gospel, who somehow read the story of Jesus in a way that they are able to reassure their listeners and followers that to be a Christian is to have God shield you from pain and suffering. And that if your faith is just strong enough, then you are only going to come to good and successful and powerful and prosperous ends. It's not just a childish question. Why did God allow Jesus to suffer? And yet, alongside that pushback to the cross, something else has been happening over the course of the past 2,000 years that has seen the cross raised up as our ultimate symbol of hope. Maybe it's the same something that draws you here today on this Good Friday. Maybe just a gut instinct in you that recognizes that if God is going to have something to say to you and your real life, then maybe the cross is key and central to that hope that you are seeking. Maybe you can recognize with me that if God had intervened and spirited Jesus away at the 11th hour to go off into the countryside to live a life of quiet, successful prosperity as a great teacher and healer, or even better, if God had intervened in some way through Jesus to overthrow Rome and to claim that crown for Jesus, to reinstate the reign of King David. Maybe you recognize with me that that would have made an interesting footnote in the historical records. But it wouldn't have said much at all about how Jesus saves us. And so maybe you with me want to join into examining that question a little more carefully. Why is it that God would allow Jesus to suffer? In order to get into that question, there are a couple of things that are really important to establish. The first is a philosophical premise, but it's a pretty simple philosophical premise, which is that suffering is part and parcel of this whole human enterprise. And there are some very good reasons why suffering is part and parcel of this whole human enterprise, because suffering is actually related to some very good things. The first is free will. The gift of free will is a good. But of course, the gift of free will does mean that we have the capacity to choose evil and to make mistakes and to cause harm and hurt to one another. The other good, and this is going to sound very strange for me to say, but the other good is actually death. Because in this life, death is a necessary part for how there is room made for new things to be born. The cycle of life, the newness of life, encompasses the reality of death. Those two goods, the goodness of human life, means that suffering is part and parcel of the whole human enterprise. And if that is true, then a God who doesn't have anything to say to our human suffering doesn't have much to say at all. And we can see how it would be of utmost and utter importance for God to speak to us through Jesus into the truth and reality of our human suffering, and to speak with hope. The other premise that we need in order to reframe Gordon's whole question is a theological premise. But again, it's quite simple. It's the premise that Jesus is God. That is not to deny Jesus' humanity, that Jesus was human just like we are. It is to say that Jesus was so completely filled with the power and presence of and purpose of God that we see that in Jesus God becomes incarnate. God becomes fully joined to our human flesh and to our human life. And when we know that second premise, then we also know that God was not doing something to Jesus on this Good Friday. Something was happening to God on this Good Friday. It was God who suffered and died on this Good Friday. It was God who was arrested in that garden, and all of his dearest friends ran away. It was God who was carted into a kangaroo trial in the middle of the night, and unjust and untrue accusations were hurled at him. It was God who was stripped and whipped and taunted and spat upon and beaten up and humiliated. It was God who was condemned to die. And it was God who was condemned to die by crucifixion, which was a particular form of death that was reserved for particular kinds of criminals, terrorists of the state, people who in some way threatened the power of Rome and had to be killed in the most horrifying and public of spectacles, not just to punish that person, but to scare off all of their followers. It was God whose body was nailed to that cross, and it was God whose body was lifted up on that cross to suffocate to death. A long, horrifying, suffocating death. It was God who, in that agony, spoke words of forgiveness. It was God who took his last breath and passed through the gate of death, as each one of us here will one day do. The one complete certainty of human life is that we will one day die. It was God who was joined fully and completely to the realities of human suffering and to the reality of what it is to be mortal. But we still haven't quite gotten to the heart of that question, to the why and what that God was offering in becoming so fully part of our human life. Companionship is no small thing. It is no small thing to say that God is joined to us in our darkest hours, in the times when we feel most alone, forsaken, scared, in pain. It's no small thing to say that we are not alone, that God is with us, and that God is always and forever reaching out a hand to us, drawing us close in love and wanting to blanket us and surround us in that love. That is no small thing. But that's not the entirety of what is being offered to us on this Good Friday. Because God goes one step further than just companionship in Jesus. God makes a promise of redemption. God makes a promise to be with us in our suffering, not just as a companion, but as one who is at work. One who is at work gathering up our human suffering and responding to that human suffering with love, with light, with new life. Promising that there is no dark hour through which God's light is not going to break through. There is no voice of hatred that will not be answered by God's love. And that gate of death, by God's powerful love, will lead us to new life. We're here this morning as people who perhaps know something of what it is to be broken and brokenhearted. And we receive a promise today in the cross. We receive the promise that we can look with expectation in our times of suffering. We can look with expectation for the God who will be with us in love, who is with us in love, and who does not forsake us. We can look with expectation for how God is redeeming us, redeeming our darkness, redeeming the hatred, redeeming death, and calling us and claiming us for love and light and life. I saw something of the redemption of God at work in a story that probably all of you heard this week, saw this week. The fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And we can say that it was just a building and no lives were lost. And yet I believe that the grief that people felt in watching that 800-year-old church burn, I believe that grief was real. I believe that people felt that there was a tremendous loss that they were witnessing, a loss of something of our human history and our human story and our human offering and our human prayer. That sense of loss and grief was real. And yet I also saw the God of redemption at work. I saw God's redeeming power as people gathered in the streets, as firefighters put out the fire and people gathered in the streets to sing hymns of prayer and praise to God. I saw God's redeeming power as people began to open up their wallets and to say with generosity that they were going to work together to rebuild. And I saw the power of God's redemption at work as all across our world, in reaction to this story, questions bubbled up. Questions bubbled up as to whether there is something of our relationship with God and our prayer with God that can be and must be reclaimed and reborn. And so today, on this Good Friday, I leave you with this image which you would have received in your leaflets today. It is from the inside of Notre Dame Cathedral this week, as the fire was raging, as the smoke and ash were all around. And there you can see the cross in the center, raised up and full of light, promising that we can look with expectation for the God who is with us always and forever, reaching out to us to claim us and redeem us, and to promise that love and light and life prevails. Amen.